What's the best part of a Dunkin' run? The coffee or the $1 donut? $2 stuffed bagel minis or $3 sausage, egg, and cheese you can add to that coffee? Or the fact that you get to leave the office? The answer, of course, is yes. Time for a Dunkin' run. Great deals on food for $1, $2, or $3 with a medium or larger coffee. America runs on Dunkin'. Excludes specialty donuts and fancies. Price and participation may vary. Limited time offer. Terms apply.
It's the SNL Hall of Fame podcast with your host, Jamie Dew, Chief Librarian Thomas Senna, and featuring Matt Ardill. And now, curator of the hall, Jamie Dew.
Thank you so much for downloading the SNL Hall of Fame podcast. It's a weekly affair, and each episode we take a deep dive into the career of a former cast member, host, musical guest, or writer, and add them to the ballot for your consideration. Once the nominees have been announced, we turn to you, the listener, to vote for the most deserving and help determine who will be enshrined for perpetuity in the hall. Of course, we also ask that you wipe your feet before crossing the threshold into said Hall of Fame building. We want to keep it nice and neat and tidy, and this spring muck is doing no good for anyone. So there's that. This week on the podcast, we welcome back Andrew Clark from Humber College and the Globe and Mail. Andrew is the dean of the comedy program at Humber College, and it's a really fun program. I went through it years ago. Before Andrew was there, Andrew was a history teacher. He taught the history of comedy, but we didn't get him in my cohort. What do you say we move over to our friend Matt Ardill and talk to him in Matt's Minutia Minute? Oh, Matt.
Hey, Jamie. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. How are you doing?
I am great, and I am super excited for today's topic of trivia. The wild Elliot Gould.
Wild. Okay.
It was like he was everywhere in the 70s. Height 6'3", born August 29th, 1938. He's a 6-time host. He is a New Yorker through and through, so that he was such a big fixture of SNL in those early years makes sense. He was born in Brooklyn. He was a shy kid. His mother made him take elocution, dance, and acting lessons. She brought him to art and fashion shows, and eventually he got his career in the entertainment world as a child model.
What?
He didn't really enjoy acting as a kid, but developed a persona as a great impersonator, which paid off because he got his big break by later impersonating a Broadway agent to a producer and then recommending himself for an audition, which resulted in his first Broadway role starring in Rumple.
Wow. That's great.
He has 196 acting roles, and he's a 5-time producer. He struggled as an actor to the point he had to continue working as an elevator boy before he eventually landed a role next to Barbra Streisand. Married 3 times, twice to Jennifer Bogart, and once to the Barbra Streisand. During that time he was married to Barbara, the press would regularly refer to him as Mr. Streisand, which he didn't really appreciate.
I would.
His breakout role was as Trapper John MD from the movie MASH, not the TV show. While he was filming MASH, he lived in the same New York luxury high-rise as his co-star, Donald Sutherland, which helped with their rapport.
I bet.
He was originally cast to star in Everything You Wanted to Know About Sex, but were afraid to ask, but backed out, making way for Woody Allen to take the part.
Huh.
He, along with George Clooney, Brad Pitt, and Julia Roberts, have all appeared both in Ocean's movies and in the television show Friends.
Wow, that's a good one.
He's the only performer to have had a cameo in more than one classic Muppet movie. He's in both the Muppet movie and Muppets Take Manhattan.
Ah.
And if I do say so myself, that is the best Muppet movie except for A Muppet Christmas Carol.
Oh.
And I will fight people for that.
Okay, I won't fight.
He has appeared in 4 films selected by the Library of Congress as culturally significant: MASH, The Long Goodbye, Nashville, and, of course, The Muppet Movie. And weirdly, he has starred as Noah in The Last Flight of Noah's Ark in 1980, then played God in Noah's Ark, The New Beginning in 2008.
Wow.
Which is a strange parallel in one's career.
I would say so.
Anyways, that's my trivia. Thank you, Jamie, for letting me do this today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And we'll talk to you next week again when we are talking about Herb Sargent. So let's go downstairs now to our friends Thomas Senna and Andrew Clark talking about Elliot Gould.
Season 1, Episode 9 was the first time that he hosted. So that was January 10th, 1976. So around that time in the mid-70s, where might you say Elliot Gould was, like in the Hollywood hierarchy of that time?
Well, he was a certified, star. I think he was still married to Barbra Streisand at the time.
Oh, yeah.
And, he had a number of, he was, the star of MASH. He was someone who'd worked very closely with the great Robert Altman, in MASH. The Long Goodbye was, a huge motion picture for him. California Shuffle. Geez, I'm going to blank on that. California Split. Mm-hmm. I want to say California Suite, but that's totally different. That's a Neil Simon play. And he had done Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice. So he would be, a very, very hip and, well sought after actor and a pretty cool guy. I mean, one of the things that Elliot Gould has is, a tremendous amount of, charisma. And he isn't someone who came to acting sort of late. In many of the episodes that he does, his monologue is a song that he just goes right into. But his parents had him in tap dancing lessons and, doing theater as a young kid, in part to get over, I think, sort of shyness and that kind of thing.
Interesting. Yeah, that was one thing that surprised me in rewatching the episodes, was that it became a tradition for his monologues to be a song and dance type of number, and I wasn't really aware of his background in that.
As you listen to the band, don't you get a bubble? As you listen to them play, don't you get a glow? When you step out on the floor, you'll forget your trouble. If you go into your dance, you'll forget your woe. So come get together, let the dance floor feel your leather. Step as lightly as a feather, let yourself go.
Because he's such a great film actor, you wouldn't think right off the bat that he had this great Broadway pedigree, but that's where he started, in doing musicals like Irma la Douce or Say Darling in the late 50s. He's in the Broadway musical I Can Get It For You Wholesale, which has 300 performances.
Wow.
And that's where he met Barbra Streisand. So he's got this really great live theater background and was yet able to kind of create what I think he called, at least in the Long Goodbye, which is an adaptation of the Raymond Chandler novel, jazz acting. I mean, it's a kind of a great percussion to it. And one of the things that I think strikes me about watching Elliot Gould act is a little bit like James Gandolfini is, you really don't think he's acting. You kind of feel like you're just peeking into somebody's life. The opening scene of The Long Goodbye, where his cat wakes him up and he has to go to the all-night grocery store to buy cat food, and he's like half awake. I think one of the critics called him Rip Van Marlowe. I mean, this is just a beautiful piece of film acting, understatement, and yet there's a kind of, throughout that movie, there's a kind of broil that's happening as he sees the way things are unfolding, the way justice isn't being meted out properly. You know what I mean? Like he's a real anti-hero, in that, and yet he's got that core to him, right?
Yeah, one of his appearances, brief appearances in a movie from around this time, it was like a year before he hosted SNL, that kind of speaks to what you were saying about how he was cool and how, I guess, where he stood in Hollywood was appearing in Nashville pretty briefly, because he was positioned as, like, he played himself in Nashville very briefly. He was positioned as like this star, this kind of cool guy. So I guess, watching Nashville, that kind of tells you where Elliot Gould might have been around that time in Hollywood.
Yeah. And then, of course, he reprises it in The Player. He's in The Player just very briefly at an awards dinner. You get like one shot of Elliot Gould, which is like vintage, because The Player, which of course he does not play a big role in, has the most Oscar winners and Oscar nominees of any movie, but they're all extras. So it's like all these really famous Hollywood people. So why then did that lend itself to the 70s, and to Saturday Night Live? I think, when I'm looking at Elliot Gould in any of those scenes, man, he's the ultimate anchor or grounder. I mean, he's funny, but he is just playing into those scenes, keeping them going, letting the other people around him be creative, and letting John Belushi have the lines as Corleone in the group therapy sketch, where it's a group therapy and Don Corleone's confessing about how he feels about the Barzonis or whatever. He's always sort of anchoring these scenes, and he has a real ease to him, or I remember him playing like a very weird sketch, The Widettes, where everyone has a huge butt, or an alcoholic who sees the mascots from various, like Johnny Walker, I think, is like one of the his Christmas spirits that he relates to.
There's like
so he has a big range.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, that was one of my main notes too, is when rewatching these episodes, was that it seemed like Elliot was really wonderful at being part of an ensemble during sketches. I mean, we see a lot of hosts who sometimes it feels like they have to be the dominant personality in the sketches or in the show. To me, what I loved about Elliot was that he seemed almost willing, or almost, I don't know if it's preferred, but he was just very willing to be part of that ensemble to make the sketch kind of go. So yeah. Mm-hmm. So I think you definitely spoke to that. I was curious though, where were you around this time as far as your SNL fandom, or kind of your comedy fandom around this time? Kind of where were you?
I was pretty young. I trying to remember. I mean, I first saw Saturday Night Live on tape. And it was one of my aunt's boyfriends had a 3/4 inch VCR that he used to tape Saturday Night Live. And we watched, the very first thing I ever saw on videotape was the Wild and Crazy Guy, Steve Martin, Dan Aykroyd thing. So I wasn't staying up to watch Saturday Night Live. I had to sort of experience most of them after the fact of this era. But then as soon as things like Animal House and all of that happened, I was right there with my face pressed against the glass. Not old enough to go and see, Animal House when it goes out. But of course, then not soon after, and of course I'm really dating myself, but the practice was that you would reserve the, one VHS or beta machine that the video store had for the weekend. You would come, you'd give a pint of blood, passport, and then you would take home whatever tapes they had. And so you got what they had. And so often they had, Caddyshack, Emmanuel, Diary of a Woman, A Clockwork Orange, Animal House, The Godfather. Like, it was whatever. And then
you have yourself an eclectic weekend if you got all of those at the same.
Because it was my friend Dave Lang's older brother who would rent it. And so the older brother and all their friends would sit in the front, and we would sort of sit at the back. And this, when you rented these machines, you ran them 24 hours a day. So the movies played constantly for two and a half days over the weekend. Wow. Because you had to get because this is incredibly, it was like, for us, it was, I don't want to date myself, but, I was of a generation where, and I think this informs actually, interestingly enough, Saturday Night Live and Lorne Michaels and the program itself, and brings us back to Elliot Gould. Maybe the last generation, if you will, where the TV was in charge. You watched what was on. And if you missed the Charlie Brown Christmas, you missed it. See you next year. There was no way that you would see it again. So the TV had an enormous amount of power. And I think when you look at what Saturday Night Live is kind of doing, is it's the people who grew up with that, the baby boomers, you love it and you hate it. So now it's our turn to destroy television, the thing that was in charge, so to speak. So, and I think Elliot Gould, is definitely a part of that wave. Like, I think of him when I think of, the golden age of Hollywood, if you will, the 60s and 70s, I definitely think of Elliot Gould because he's so distinctive. I mean, his performance in MASH is really something. It's a really great piece of comic understatement. And I think he always brought that to the show. And I, bring it back to what you said, you really get the feeling that part of why he did it was he probably liked doing it. And the show's new, basically. He's helped. This is a star lending star power to something that's trying to find its feet, right? This is not someone being on Saturday Night Live in the 90s or the 2000s or whatever. This is Elliot Gould, big, credible, he's the first person, I think the first sort of American star to be in an Ingmar Bergman movie, The Touch.
Oh, really?
Like, this is a guy who has real chops, who I think has a real sort of innate understanding of how to communicate as an actor on television, but specifically on film. And I think you see that. So, we used to talk a little bit about, like, I didn't do a lot of movie reviewing or whatnot, but we used to joke about Canadian actors that they would hire to act next to stars who couldn't act. Mm-hmm. And I want to mention them. None of them would mind, but like one of their last names rhymes with Eeyore, put it that way, and he's in Stratford. So it would be like, if you put this actor in a scene with me, he could almost make it look like I could act because they're that good.
Yeah.
They can almost react for me. So I don't think that that's what you needed Elliot Gould for on Saturday Night Live, but he brings an element of that. Like, they're all way out, probably strung out, some of them, right? And yet Elliot Gould's just rooted like a tree in most of the scenes that he's doing. And so that allows those guys to do their thing. And I don't think it's an accident. I think he, understood what he was doing. And I think he probably understood that, he was part of something interesting and different. And I think that was a big part of his artistic sensibility, which I think is you can see. I mean, his career went up and down, all careers do. But he never really, I don't think, sort of got away from the thing that made him, so watchable.
Yeah, that's very well said. And it's interesting to me looking at just season 1 of Saturday Night Live and the first few episodes. And it almost seems like Lorne Michaels and the production team, with their choices of hosts, they were trying to go for people, like you said, they didn't take any big swings in terms of folks who they weren't sure how they would mesh with the show. You saw George Carlin, Paul Simon, Rob Reiner, Candice Bergen twice in those first few. Richard Pryor had a really famous episode, Lily Tomlin. So it was all these people who I think that Lorne Michaels felt that he could trust with the show. And it says to me a lot about Elliot Gould that he hosted the 9th episode of the first season. It says a lot to me that he was part of that group that Lorne Michaels probably felt that like he could trust, like the show was in good hands, you know?
Absolutely. I think that because the show is now such an iconic institution, people kind of forget that Lorne Michaels was not always, quote, Lorne Michaels, right? So he's not the kingmaker at this point in time, if you will. He's a producer who's really sweating it, trying to get this really unwieldy ship off the ground. And so, yeah, he's not only looking for people he can trust, but he's looking for people that he could get.
Yeah.
So who knows? I mean, you'd have to ask him. But I mean, Elliot Gould, you're like, okay, we know he's good. We know he's a star. He did it before. Let's do it. Because it wasn't like, I mean, everybody, it's a little bit like everybody claiming that they saw, you know, the Police at the Horseshoe whenever it was in 79. And there's only like 33 people there, but there must be about 3,000 who claim to have been there. So there's a lot of people who tell you that they knew Saturday Night Live was going to take off in 76, but I don't think so. I mean, the headline Saturday Night Dead ran almost immediately once the show went on the air. So I do think that it's that. And I think it's a producer who's young, who's really hungry, and who knows this is a big shot for him. I mean, and I think that, again, it's hard for people now because the show has had such longevity and he's had such a huge impact on comedy, period, to remember that there was a time when it could not have gone well and not everybody wanted to be associated with the show and not everybody wanted to go on board. And, they were really trying to find their footing.
Yeah,
so
Lorne
I think
Lorne had to, he had a big network to prove himself to, which is, NBC. That was kind of a jump for him. And he had to kind of show NBC why they should air his show as opposed to possibly going back to Johnny Carson reruns or something else, right? Because that's why SNL kind of exists, is because Johnny Carson didn't want his reruns aired.
They didn't want her reruns aired, and they were looking for a pilot, and I think Lorne had been through a few things, and he's like, I'll do it, but I want a guaranteed number because he knew the show would take time to stick. Of course, it's famous that he didn't want to go to New York; he wanted to stay in LA and not have the show there. And I think that the notion that anyone would be up late watching TV was completely absurd to a lot of people in the television world. It's just sort of weird that it all took off, and we can kind of all look back on it now. But I think that with Elliot Gould, you're getting a great actor who you can trust, and frankly, who's also part of that sensibility. There's Elliot Gould is definitely an outsider looking in. I think when you look at his most iconic roles, they're often that anti-establishment. Even the movie Getting Straight, which is on, I think, Hollywood Suite. It won't be on necessarily by the time this airs, but he's often playing an anti-establishment, anti-corporate, an outsider. So he fit perfectly, and he's a handsome guy. He's a charismatic guy. It's not like he's going to be hard for anyone to look at. So. He's not Candice Bergen, but he has a charisma, and I think that's also something that the show wanted. And, they're matching him up with, musical guests like Peter Tosh or Kid Creole and the Coconuts in the 80s. As I understand it, he, the last episode he was on, I think he thought that Lorne was still the producer. And in fact, he was no longer a producer, and sort of gets to the rehearsal, like, where's Lorne? And they're kind of like, he's not here.
Yeah.
Lorne's not here,
Yeah,
so
definitely. I did want to dive into some of his specific kind of work on SNL a little bit too. And so, like I said, he had first hosted January 10th, 1976. And there was a running thread throughout that show of he and Gilda having sort of a romance. It started with the monologue, and Gilda kind of came out, and they chatted there.
What are you doing after the show?
Tonight?
Yeah.
Oh, Gilda, I got to fly right back to California in the morning, so I got to go back to my hotel, pack, and then I thought I'd just go to sleep.
Oh, okay. Look, I'm a grown woman. I understand how things happen between people, and I just want you to know that I meant everything I said last night.
Me too.
Really? Okay, bye.
And that just kind of kept going throughout the whole show. What kind of chemistry or did you notice between two people who were quite frankly two of the more charming people in show business from around that time?
Well, I think that it's one playing on the fact that Elliot Gould, was a subject of the tabloid press, and like his love life was a subject of the press. So there's that. And I also think that, you take two charming people and throw them into a lifeboat, sort of. And it sort of sets up, because we're going to see this with other hosts, where various cast members, often, the female cast members are going to have a crush, or they're going to have that through line. I don't think that you see it a ton where there's a running joke like this. It's not like a blueprint.
Might just happen during the monologue or something. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, if Justin Timberlake's on, people come out, or if Idris Elba's on, there's going to be people there to talk about what a, charismatic, hunky guy he is. So I think it's playing on those things, and Elliot Gould's sort of status a little bit as a heartthrob or a sex symbol. And Gilda's great. I mean, she was someone who could really act, right? I mean, who's got that, and a lot of her best characters had a real core truth to them.
Truth and likability, definitely. Yeah. And so at the end of that episode, that first episode that he hosted, he and Gilda end up during the good nights. They have this wedding ceremony, and they decide that they're going to get hitched or whatever. So that was kind of a fun button on that running gag. Second time he hosted, May 29th, 1976, another singing monologue, which was wonderful again. He's in a very, very famous sketch, and I guess for a long time I didn't realize that he was in that. That's kind of speaks to playing with the ensemble, but he was in a Star Trek sketch in that episode. What do you remember about that sketch and his involvement?
Well, it's sort of so much about John Belushi as Kirk, right? Mm-hmm. And Chevy Chase as Spock. You do kind of forget it, and you forget like what a role he's playing in there, throughout. And I mean, it was like they revisited Star Trek on numerous occasions, right? Mm-hmm. He was also in Killer Bees later on. I don't want to jump the gun. So he was in quite a few sort of really iconic things. What did you make of him in Star Trek?
I thought that he had the perfect personality for somebody who was supposed to be basically canceling the show.
I'm Captain James C. Kirk of the Starship Enterprise, representing the United Federation of Planets.
Hi, I'm Herb Goodman, head of programming for the network.
Stand back. I will not hesitate to shoot.
Can I have your attention, please? Please, I need some attention. Curtis, will you turn the sound effects down? I'd like everybody's attention, please. I have an announcement to make. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, due to the low Nielsen ratings, we at NBC have decided to, unfortunately, cancel Star Trek.
Yeah. And he was very believable in that, just sort of his, I don't want to say, I guess is a little bit of cockiness that would come off of Elliot Gould around that time, but it wasn't like a totally negative thing, but he just had the right personality type to make it believable that he was this head of programming that was coming in and just canceling the show.
He has sunglasses on, and he's like,
exactly.
If you guys want to take any props, as a souvenir, feel free.
Yes.
I almost feel like they're having a bit of fun with Saturday Night Live getting canceled at some point. I mean, they've all been there, but and the other thing that kind of meshes nicely with the Killer Bees is the fact that it's kind of I don't know, it's tangential. Like the sketch doesn't end. It doesn't really have an ending. The ending is getting canceled by the guy in the station wagon. Mm-hmm. Or in the Killer Bees, it's, hey, the director's passed out and the camera's not where it's supposed to be. And I hope I'm not jumping the gun. And, Elliot Gould isn't, he's not, he's giving this great speech as the Killer Bee, head honcho and, the camera's not on him and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of exposing the TV behind the TV sort of.
Yeah. That's back when SNL was more prone to be self-referential in a lot of ways and breaking the fourth wall and kind of like experimenting with that kind of comedy. The Killer Bees one that you referenced, they did break the fourth wall in that, as kind of tended to happen in those Killer Bees sketches, and They also kind of continued the Elliot Gilda romance.
Elliot, do you have a few minutes? Just wait here. There's somebody I want you to meet, okay? Oh, hi. Elliot, this is my mom. Mom, this is Elliot.
You can tell it was at the time when the show was still trying to find its voice, kind of trying to find itself, and they're trying to play with certain comedic devices and everything. And Elliot was just such a game host and willing to just try and all of that. Yeah.
He reminds me a little bit of someone like Justin Timberlake. And by that, I mean, as a host, just kind of up for anything, obviously likes doing it, or why do it? You know what I mean? But
exactly. I've always had a theory about hosts with SNL, in that I always just found it interesting that they're even called hosts in the first place, because it seems like the really good hosts almost surrender themselves to the show. So they're not like necessarily leading the show that night. They're sort of finding their place within the show and getting whisked away. So I always found it interesting. They're called hosts, but they're not the good ones aren't necessarily just grabbing the show and running with it themselves. Yeah.
And if you ask cast members, they'll usually tell you that their favorite hosts are people who were game. You know, who are up to do it. Hey, let's try it. Or, you know, went to bat for one of their sketches or whatever. You know, you have to be happy to be there and play, so to speak. Yeah. And in a very stressful environment.
Right. Yeah. So I wanted to kind of separate Elliot Gould's time, and you had kind of referenced it before, between like his Lorne Michaels hosting years and then his last hosting stint. So when he was hosting during the Lorne Michaels first 5 years, is there anything that maybe stood out to you, sketches or character or anything like that?
I mean, I think that you can see a kind of change. I mean, the first cold open, I think, of one of the post-Lorne shows is a parody almost of the movie Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice. And they're all in bed, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, definitely.
I think that the quality of those shows after Lorne, obviously, I don't think are as good, you know, in general. I never think, or I would never say that, oh, these people are terrible. I know sometimes people say that person's terrible or that cast member's terrible. I kind of look at that, and maybe I'm being a bit of a softie, but there's no bad hockey players in the NHL. There's no bad. They're not bad. They're just, you know, it just didn't work. But for some reason,
to like the other most amazing hockey players in the world, right?
Yeah, you know, they're not bad. No. It just didn't work. So, but there's sometimes this urge to be so categoric, and yet it's by the same people, which if you looked at them sideways at the photocopier, they'd be upset. So they lambaste and dismiss, you know, various cast members or this or that. They're terrible. It's like, no one's being harmed here. We're talking about a show that's worth talking about, but let's not get vindictive. So I'm not going to sort of dine out on how terrible that those seasons were. They weren't great, Frank. And I don't think necessarily maybe Elliot Gould, his heart wasn't as closely into it as it might have been when Lorne was there. But I also think he's too much of a professional to let that get in his way. I think the amount of people sometimes forget the amount of technique that goes into this, and they can do it when they're not inspired, if they have to, which is a lot. So,
And you mentioned that cold open for that cold open was a takeoff of Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice. So I actually, you know, segueing into talking more about that, I actually have a little game for you that I want to play.
Okay.
I'm going to spring up a game.
Fail.
No, you're good. There's no such thing as failing in this game.
We'll see about that.
Okay. So it's 2 truths and a lie. So I'll name 3 statements, and 2 of those statements are true, and 1 of those is a lie. So your job is to spot the lie.
Okay.
It might be tough, but we'll see. So during season 6, episode 1, during that cold open, Elliot meets the new cast members. As you had mentioned, they're all kind of laying in bed together. Some of them are compared to the original cast. So which of these statements is not true? So Gail Mathias was said to have been a cross between Gilda Radner and Jane Curtin.
Mm-hmm.
Joe Piscopo was said to have been a cross between Dan Aykroyd and Chevy Chase.
Uh-huh.
Or Gilbert Gottfried was said to have been a cross between John Belushi and Harry Shearer. So which one of those was not said in that sketch?
You know, I want to say 3, because I remember Charles Rocket, I think, being compared to a Bill Murray Chevy Chase.
And you get extra credit for that, so that's great.
Okay. Wow. All right. Good.
So Charles
I love
Rocket,
Harry Shearer, but I don't think folks back then maybe were quite as aware of him as they are today.
Well, I was going to say actually Gilbert Gottfried was compared to John Belushi and Harry Shearer. So it's actually Joe Piscopo. He actually they didn't make a comparison to Joe Piscopo. He was in the sketch, but they didn't reference like, oh, so you're a cross between X, Y, and Z. So it was Gail Mathias. So they said Gail was a cross between Gilda and Jane. Charles Rocket, a cross between Chevy and Bill Murray. Anne Risley was said to have been a cross between Gilda and Lorraine Newman. And then they said Gilbert Gottfried was a cross between John Belushi and Harry Shearer. I found that super interesting because you said, this was the first episode of the post-Lorne Michaels era, or the first era. It was Gene Dumanian that was the producer. And I found it interesting that, one, they would just flat out reference the old cast in the first episode.
Yeah.
Go
ahead.
Oh, and then 2, that Elliot Gould was actually the first host when he was so synonymous with those first 5 years.
I could say, I don't like to speak for Lorne Michaels, but I could certainly say that sketch would never have aired under Lorne Michaels for the very reason of why on earth would you remind everybody? Maybe they'd forgotten, but now you're going to remind everybody that you're a compilation of the people who are no longer there. Not a good idea. And of course, it didn't work out. Again, you look at it, some talented people, Gilbert Gottfried was no slouch, right? But I can't speak for him, but I bet a lot of money that Lorne Michaels would never have put that sketch on.
I definitely agree with you. And I kind of think, too, that tabbing Elliot Gould to host the first episode was a very concerted thing on Gene Dumanian's part to kind of kick off her first season in the very first episode on kind of a high note. I think that says a lot about Elliot too. Yeah.
And again, a bad idea. Yeah. I think, to be honest, I talked about people being mean. It's like, why would you bring someone so closely associated with the previous regime in to launch it? It just seems unwise.
Yeah.
Has nothing to do with Elliot Gould. You just think, maybe do your own thing. But again, sometimes we ascribe a lot of sort of thinking and, stuff that isn't there. It's a lot of times it just happened. People are busy, stuff's going wrong, so we sometimes ascribe, as is human nature, some nefarious plot when in fact it was just like, well, that's just the way it worked out. Doesn't make as interesting talking or reading. But
exactly. And you'd mentioned that tabbing Elliot Gould to host this episode might not have been the wisest choice. I think that's a compliment to Elliot Gould that he would still be memorable for the fans of the initial run.
Yeah. And I mean, he's, again, Elliot Gould, the people know who Elliot Gould is now. Now, they may say, oh, he's from the Ocean's 11. I remember going to an event in New York and Michael York, unbelievable actor, of course, was there. And someone said, look, it's the guy from Austin Powers. And of course, he was in Austin Powers and he was quite good, but he was also in a whole lot of other great films, right? So on the one hand, you can say, well, what about this or that? But then it's like, well, there's a career there that there are new people liking your work. And again, I think the fact that Elliot Gould has often been, and I'm not the first person to say this, there was I think her name is Tara or Tamara Brady in the Irish Times, he's often the best thing in any movie he does.
Yeah. He's
often the most memorable thing in a lot of pictures that he does. I think that's a real credit to him, as an actor and in a way I would say as a kind of filmmaker, because, we often think, filmmakers are directors. Well, great cinematic actors are also filmmakers. They just don't necessarily have final cut, but they are very, very aware of what they're doing and how they're being, how what they're doing translates onto the screen or onto the stage. And so that's the other thing I think as well. With Elliot Gould, you're talking about a guy with, if we bring it all back to the Broadway live stage pedigree. And what's Saturday Night Live? Live. And what's he done? Tons of live performance. So I think he once compared theater to the fastest sport almost, because he's a huge basketball fan and like a big sports fan. So the rush, that the fact that theater, this Saturday Night Live is essentially live theater, if you will, to air. And so having someone like Elliot Gould, then you really know he can handle it. This is not a guy who's going to, I don't think he ever corpse, put it that way.
Right.
He is not going to corpse. Elliot Gould, no, not going to happen.
So November 15, 1980, that was the episode that we had just talked about. That was his last hosting stint on Saturday Night Live was 1980. He did reappear actually in 2022, so not too long ago, in a 5-timer sketch. Did you happen to catch that 5-timer sketch?
Yeah. And I was like, I couldn't believe that he hadn't hosted again. But I guess often you're hosting because, you have a big project. And I think he's been part of a lot of big things, but at a certain point, you're not always opening movies, right? So maybe that's had something to do with it. Because I was like, really, he's never been on since 1980 as a host? I mean, geez.
I thought,
hey, it's a pretty competitive. It's a competitive world, right? There's a lot of people opening movies. But I thought that was really great, and it also reminded people, I think, in a nice way, of his contribution to the show. Because I think, frankly, him participating helped legitimize the show in a way that other people did as well, right? Mm-hmm. So you mentioned someone like Ken Spring, big star. There were stars who were friendly to the show. Steve Martin, of course, but Steve Martin, his career and Saturday Night Live are very intertwined in a lot of respects.
Yeah, definitely. It was a surprise to me when they panned to Elliot Gould during John Mulaney's five-timer sketch.
Tonight you're in the company of comedy legends and the sexiest man alive. This silly thing? Paul, that was so 2021. I'm talking about Mr. Elliot Gould.
Oh, my God, Elliot.
Paul may have People magazine, but I was named Sexiest Man Alive by Chest Hair magazine.
Hey, Elliot, do you remember being on my sitcom?
Should I?
It's really nice. I think Lorne still has he has a nostalgia and a soft spot for SNL's history. I mean, he's aware of it obviously, and he knew that would be a treat for a lot of hardcore SNL fans to see Elliot sitting there.
Yeah, and I think that Lorne Michaels, as much as he says that talking too long about comedy, you become boring after, I think, 2 minutes or something. I remember interviewing him the first time he told me that. And I think I was lucky. Then we talked about comedy for like an hour and a half. But I think he's aware of, if you will, history. And I think probably more than anyone, he probably knows how dicey things were at the beginning. And so in show business, there's people who forget everybody who helped them. And then there's the people who never forget. And I don't know. I mean, my experience with Lorne Michaels is as a journalist interviewing him, but I do get the feeling that he's someone who does remember the people who, were, good to him and to whom he owes something.
Yeah, definitely. So for our listeners, as we wrap this up to put a bow on everything, what's just kind of your final summary of why Elliot Gould would be worthy of entry into the SNL Hall of Fame?
Well, I think that he was there when the show needed him. And I think he was involved in a lot of those great sketches. And again, we weren't at the table, but maybe he was someone who helped get that weird Killer Bees sketch through, or who said, yeah, let's have it. Let's have that. The executive cancel the show. So, one of the things a host can do is the host's vibe about a sketch isn't going to trump Lorne Michaels, but it's going to have a little bit of a role to play. Because I think if you're a producer, you're like, well, the star or whatever likes it. So if I know if we do this sketch, we're going to have that going for it. So I think he's an important part of that era. I think people kind of crap on the 70s Saturday Night Live sometimes. And say, oh, wasn't that funny or whatever. It's like, well, honestly, I think the ratio is pretty good. But as well, they're finding the show's identity. And so So when Elliot Gould's going on, he's going on to a pretty chaotic environment where people are trying to find their footing. And so I think he's probably an important part of that. And I hope that he gets to host again at some point. But again, that's none of my business, but it'd be kind of fun to have him see. And I think that it can't be underestimated, how important of a celebrity and a star he was in the 70s. And that's not to diminish his career now or anything like that. But generally speaking, you're only that hip and cool and talented for so long. And then the wheel comes around and then you become a legend, or, you get venerated by people and you wonder if you're pertinent anymore. Yeah. So I guess that's where I'd come at it. Like a funny guy who really could ground scenes, and who I think probably Lorne Michaels looked to and said, yeah, if we have him, we know we're going to have a good show. And if it doesn't work, it's not going to be the host.
Yeah. Well said. Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining me today.
Thank you. It's great fun.
That was Thomas Senna in conversation with Andrew Clark talking about Elliot Gould. And thank you so much, boys. You schooled me in terms of Elliot Gould. Not that I was thinking he was just Ross's dad, Ross and Monica's dad, but really, he slowed down to the point where that was the only work he was he was doing a lot of other work. He was doing the Ocean's movies and stuff, I suppose. But we didn't see a whole lot of him after having access to him in the way that we did in the 70s. Let's listen to the sketch now. This is actually a monologue. This is actually Mr. Gould's first monologue ever, from his first episode ever. So why don't we give it a listen and see what we get? And we'll go from there.
Well, I just got in, and this is a lucky. And does anybody know who won the Islander game? Oh, they were behind the Russians 2-1. I know it's over, but the island is where I'm coming from, Bell Harbor. And, okay, I went back, got some old music. Paul Schaefer's gonna play for me. Okay. Ha! La-la! As you listen to the band, don't you get a bubble? As you listen to them play, don't you get a glow? When you step out on the floor, you'll forget your trouble. If you go into your dance, you'll forget your woe. So come get together, let the dance floor feel your leather. Step as lightly as a feather, let yourself go. Come hit the timber, loosen up and start to limber. Can't you hear that hot marimba? Let yourself go. Now let yourself go, relax, and let yourself go, relax. You got yourself tied up in a knot. The night is cold, but the music's hot, so cuddle closer. Don't you dare to answer no, sir. Butcher, baker, clerk, or grocer, let yourself go. Crazy rhythm, here's a doorway. You go your way, I'll go my way. Crazy rhythm, here's goodbye to you. Here is where we have a showdown. You're too hi-hat, I'm too low down. Crazy rhythm, here's goodbye to you. Suspenders. They say that when a highbrow meets a lowbrow walking along Broadway, soon the highbrow, he got no brow. Ain't it a shame? You are to blame. What's the use of prohibition? You produce the same condition. Crazy rhythm, I've gone crazy too. Thanks for the gum.
Oh, you're welcome.
You okay?
Yeah. Elliot, I just wanted to tell you I had a wonderful time last night.
Oh,
Thank you.
me too. I had a ball.
Really? After you left my place this morning, I was a little nervous about seeing you today, but I don't feel guilty or anything because I know I like you, and you said you like me, right?
Sure do.
What are you doing after the show?
Tonight?
Yeah.
Oh, Gilda, I got to fly right back to California in the morning, so I got to go back to my hotel, pack, and then I thought I'd just go to sleep.
Oh, okay. Look, I'm a grown woman. I understand how things happen between people. And I just want you to know that I meant everything I said last night.
Me too.
Really? Okay, bye.
Okay? We'll be right back after this message.
I wonder what the message was that they came back from. That stuff makes me curious. Not as slick or as, beautiful as the monologues that we get nowadays. But he's just showing his chops there. He's showing off what he can do and showing that he's game and that he's ready for wherever this episode is going to take him. Because quite frankly, like Andrew said, they were still formulating the shape of the show in the 9th episode. It didn't have, full mass yet. It was still protoplasmic, if you will. So there's that. That's what I got for you this week on the SNL Hall of Fame. I hope you enjoyed yourself. As always, next week we will be talking about Herb Sargent. Should be a great episode. Tune in for that when I'm back reunited with Matt and Thomas. And of course, we'll have another great guest. So there's that. But if I could ask you one thing, it's that on your way out, as you walk past the Weekend Update exhibit, could you turn out the lights? Because the SNL Hall of Fame is now closed.
Thanks for listening to the SNL Hall of Fame podcast. Make sure to rate, review, share, and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on social media at SNLHOF. This is Doug Denant saying, see you next week.
To podcasts and such.
So, how does it feel when you play Roll Up to Win with Tim Hortons? Buy a hot or cold beverage using the Tim's app and find out. Roll in the app for a chance to win prizes ranging from free coffee and donuts to a Universal Orlando resort vacation or a sweet car. Oh, don't forget the TV. And this year, every roll is a shot at a $1,000 daily giveaway drawing for 2 $500 prizes. Roll up to win and get treated by Tim's. No purchase necessary. Account registration required. 50 U.S. and D.C. 18 plus entered by 4/2/23. See rules at rolluptowin.com for free entry or full details. Void in Florida and where prohibited.
Everyone loves TV Dad.
On the next TV Dad, presented by Progressive, TV Dad gets us through heartache.
Chin up, sport.
Oh, hey, TV Dad.
You know what heals all wounds?
Time?
No, it's remembering that drivers who switch and save with Progressive could save hundreds.
But Jen still doesn't want to be with me.
True. I actually saw her with your friend Brian earlier.
Wait, what?
Listen to your TV Dad. Drivers who switch and save with Progressive could save hundreds. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Potential savings will vary.